At the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, there was a great deal of concern about youth crime and youth gangs. Commentators were concerned that the energies of adolescent youth needed to be channeled into good and useful activities. And we see at that time the emergence of youth movements like the Boys Brigade and the Boy Scouts movement. And part of this was about kind of channeling the energies of adolescent youth into good and useful activities. But concern about youth crime went across the newspapers of the nation, and many cities talked about the concern of youth gangs in their urban areas. So in 19th century Manchester and Salford, we had scuttling gangs, and they existed in other cities around the country. In the early 20th century, Hull was no different. There was a great deal of concern in the local newspapers about the activities of youths and the association with youth gangs. The Hull Daily Mail reported that gang members were active with knuckle dusters and knives, and that they plagued the city streets. This was particularly highlighted in 1913 when there was a brutal assault on a dock labourer called John Hutchinson. It was alleged in court that the 3 youths charged with his offence had kicked him to death in the city streets. They subsequently pleaded guilty to manslaughter and were sentenced to long periods of imprisonment. But youth and concern about youth crime is something that has periodically occurred throughout the 20th century and continues today.
Helen's historical examples of media representations of crime and youth gangs is absolutely fascinating, and of course still completely relevant today. Social scientists sometimes describe themselves as destroyers of myths, because one of their central concerns is to question these myths that often appear in political and media discourse. The most famous exponent of this, of course, was Stanley Cohen, who coined the term moral panic to describe these kind of exaggerated outbursts and public concern about the morality or behaviour of certain groups, often young people, of course. Stanley Cohen thought these were kind of exaggerated and distorted responses when compared with more objective and reliable indicators of these problems. Let me just give 2 examples to illustrate. We've often heard over the last decade or so about the problem of teenage binge drinking and how this is associated with all kinds of problems, crime and delinquency and so on. But if you look at the latest statistic provided by the NHS on drinking amongst young people in England, we find between 2003 and 2013 a pretty sharp decline in the number of people who say they've ever tried alcohol in this age group. In fact, only 40% of boys and girls say they've ever tried alcohol. This is a significant drop. So there seems to be some exaggeration going on here in this kind of panic about binge drinking. A second example, we also hear stories about soaring rates of teenage pregnancy and how this is associated with all kinds of problems again, crime and delinquency and so on. But Jock Young, in his book, Vertigo of Late Modernity, he said, let's look at the evidence. So he went to the statistics on fertility rates amongst different age groups, and he found between 1981 and 2001, teenage fertility rates were very, very stable. There's the odd blip here and there in the 90s, but he said the biggest increase in fertility rates was actually amongst women in their 30s and 40s. In fact, the age category 30 to 34 saw an 84% increase in fertility rates. And this is supported by the most recent statistics as well, which show that over the last 2 decades, teenage fertility rates have actually halved. So Jock Young says, what's going on here? Why are politicians and the media panicking about something that's remarkably stable, it seems, teenage fertility rates, but seem to have no concern about fertility rates amongst other age groups, older age groups, which have seen an exponential increase? One thing you might want to do in your classes is a short exercise to think about any moral panics in relation to young people and crime or deviance that have taken place over the last 5 years, and then see if you can question them by looking at more objective and reliable indicators.